This news is funded by viewers like you. Please support our work at democracynow.org/give. This is Democracy Now! As we continue our discussion of President Jimmy Carter's legacy, we look at his policies in the Middle East and North Africa, in particular Israel and Palestine. Thursday, during the funeral, President Carter's former advisor, Stuart Eizenstat, praised Carter's work on facilitating the Camp David peace accords between Israel and Egypt in '78.
Jimmy Carter's most lasting achievement, and the one I think he was most proud of, was to bring the first peace to the Middle East through the greatest act of personal diplomacy in American history, the Camp David Accords. For 13 days and nights, he negotiated with Israel's Menachem Begin and Egypt's Anwar Sadat, personally drafting more than 20 peace proposals and shuttling them between the Israeli and Egyptian delegations. And he saved the agreement at the 11th hour, and it was the 11th hour, by appealing to Begin's love of his grandchildren. For the past 45 years, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty has never been violated and laid the foundation for the Abraham Accords.
The Abraham Accords are the bilateral normalization agreements between Israel and as well and the United Arab Emirates and Israel and Bahrain, signed in 2020. In 2006, years after he left office, Jimmy Carter wrote a book called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, in which he compared Israel's treatment of Palestinians to South Africa's former racist regime. It was striking for a former U.S. president to use the words Palestine, let alone apartheid, in referring to the occupied territories. I went down to the Carter Center to speak with President Jimmy Carter about the controversy around his book and what he wanted the world to understand.
The word apartheid is exactly accurate. You know, this is an area that's occupied by two powers. They're now completely separated. The Palestinians can't even ride on the same roads that the Israelis have created or built in Palestinian territory. The Israelis never see a Palestinian except the Israeli soldiers. The Palestinians never see an Israeli except at a distance, except the Israeli soldiers. So within Palestinian territory, they're absolutely and totally separated, much worse than they were in South Africa, by the way. And the other thing is, the other definition of apartheid is one side dominates the other. And the Israelis completely dominate the life of the Palestinian people.
Why don't Americans know what you have seen?
Americans don't want to know, and many Israelis don't want to know what is going on inside Palestine. It's a terrible human rights persecution that far transcends what any outsider would imagine. And there are powerful political forces in America that prevents any objective analysis of the problem in the Holy Land. I think it's accurate to say that not a single member of Congress with whom I'm familiar would possibly speak out and call for Israel to withdraw to their legal boundaries, or to publicize the plight of the Palestinians, or even to call publicly and repeatedly for good faith peace talks. There hadn't been a day of peace talks now in more than 7 years. So this is a taboo subject, and I would say that if any member of Congress did speak out, as I've just described, they would probably not be back into Congress the next term.
President Jimmy Carter, to see that whole interview we did at the Carter Center, you can go to democracynow.org. For more on his legacy on the Middle East during his presidency and beyond, we're joined in London by historian Seth Anziska, professor of Jewish-Muslim relations at University College London, author of Preventing Palestine, A Political History from Camp David to Oslo. What should we understand about the legacy of President Carter, Professor Anziska?
Well, thank you, Amy. I think primarily the biggest lesson is that when he came into office, he was the first U.S. president to talk about the idea of a Palestinian homeland alongside his commitment to Israeli security. And that was an enormous change from what had come before and what's come since. And I think that the way we understand Carter's legacy should very much be oriented around the very deep commitment he had to justice and a resolution of the Palestinian question alongside his commitment to Israel, which derived very much from his Southern Baptist faith.
And talk about the whole trajectory. Talk about the Camp David Accords, for which he was hailed throughout the various funeral services this week and has been hailed in many places around the world.
Well, I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about the legacy of Camp David is that this is not at all what Carter had intended or had hoped for when he came into office. He actually had a much more comprehensive vision of peace in the Middle East that included a resolution of the Palestinian component, but also peace with Syria, with Jordan. And he came up with some of these ideas, developed them with Cyrus Vance, as Secretary of State, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor. And in developing those ideas, which came out in 1977 in a very closely held memo that was not widely shared inside the administration, he actually talked about return of refugees, he talked about the status of Jerusalem, and he desired very much to think about the different components of the regional settlement as part of an overall vision. This was in contrast to Henry Kissinger's attitude of piecemeal diplomacy that had preceded him in the aftermath of the 1973 war. So we can understand Carter in this way very much as a departure and somebody who understood the value and the necessity of contending with these much broader regional dynamics. Now, the reasons why this ended up with a far more limited but very significant bilateral peace treaty between Egypt and Israel had a lot to do both with the election of Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin in 1977, as well as the position of Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat, and also the role of the Palestinians and the PLO. But what people don't quite recall or understand is that Camp David and the agreement towards the peace treaty was in many ways a compromise, or in Brzezinski's view, was a real departure from what had been the intention. And that gap between what people had hoped for within the administration and what ended up emerging in 1979 with the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty also was tethered very much to the perpetuation of Palestinian statelessness. So if we want to understand why and how Palestinians have been deprived of sovereignty or remain stateless to this day, we have to go back to think about the impact of Camp David itself.
Interesting that Sadat would be assassinated years later in Egypt. When Carter was on the plane with Nixon and Ford, that's when they say that cemented his relationship with Ford, while they hardly talked to Nixon at all. But if you could also comment on President Carter and post-President Carter. I mean, the fact that he wrote this book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, using the word Palestine, using the word apartheid to refer to the occupied territories. I remember him chasing him down the hall at the Democratic Convention when he was supposed to speak. This was the Obama Democratic Convention. And it ended up he didn't speak. And I chased him and Roseland because...
Remember that in 1977, there was a very famous speech that he gave in Clinton, Massachusetts, talking about a Palestinian homeland. And that raised huge hackles, both in the American Jewish community, amongst American Jewish leaders who were very uncomfortable and were already distrustful of a Southern Democrat and his views on Israel, but also Cold War conservatives who were quite hawkish and felt that he was far too close to engaging with the Soviet Union. And so both of those constituencies were very, very opposed to his attitude and his approach on the Palestinian issue. And I think we can see echoes of that in how he then was treated after his presidency, when much of his activism and much of his engagement on the question of Palestine to my view, derived from a sense of frustration and regret about what he was not able to achieve in the Camp David Accords. And his commitment stemmed from the same values that he had been shaped by early on, a sense of viewing the Palestinian issue through the same lens as civil rights and the same lens as what he experienced in the South, which is often what his biographers have explained, where his views and approach towards the Palestinians came from, but also a particularly close relationship to biblical views around Israel and Zionism, that he was very much committed to Israeli security as a result. And that was never something that he let go of, even if you look closely at his work in Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. Some of his views on Israel are actually quite closely aligned with positions that many in the Jewish community would feel comfortable with. The fact that people criticized and attacked him for that, I think, speaks to the taboo of talking about what's happening or what has happened in the context of Israel and Palestine in the same kind of language as disenfranchisement around race in apartheid South Africa. And of course, as Carter said in the interview you just ran that you had done with him when the book came out, the situation is far worse in actuality with what is happening vis-a-vis Israel's treatment of Palestinians.
Democracy Now! Is funded by viewers like you. Please give today at democracynow.org/give.